Wrestling history is full of happy accidents, people who came around at just the right time to get over when they perhaps wouldn't have done so to the same extent in a different era. But what are the biggest examples of this happening in WWE? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now, starting with Val Venis. Yes, when you think back to the Attitude Era, you often think of the edgy gimmicks that WWE were able to get away with back then. And few were more approaching the line than that of Val Venis, a wrestler who moonlighted as an actor in the world of adult entertainment. Seriously, if you put this gimmick in any other time period, it almost certainly fails to be anywhere near as successful, as if it came around during the 80s, the moral panic it would have created would have been outrageous, and if it had come around during the 2000s or beyond, it would have felt like an act very much out of time. During the late 90s, however, it fit in perfectly with the direction WWF was going in, a direction which centered around wild storylines above all else. So for one of the more popular mid-card acts of the era to come down to the ring every week making double entendres and wearing little else but a towel, it certainly fit the bill for what the fans were looking for. Come on now, we all remember that infamous choppy your pee-pee angle where Val almost got his manhood cut off by Kai and Tai with a samurai sword. It was the kind of insane television that could have only gotten over during the Attitude Era. And even if audiences were still looking for the same thing today, sponsors probably aren't. So while there was some pushback to Val Venis at the time from parents groups, today the whole thing would be unlikely to get past week one, as prominent WWE sponsors such as Slim Jim or Snickers would be unlikely to want it on TV. Yes, the chances of another Val Venis style gimmick appearing in modern day WWE are small. So it's just as well he came around during the Attitude Era then, as there he was able to thrive as a popular staple of Monday Night Raw. But he wasn't the only late 90s wrestler in WWF whose gimmick centered around him working in the adult entertainment industry. No, the same could be said about our next subject too, the man known back then as the Godfather. That's right, if Val Venis was WWF's resident man on the ground when it came to adult entertainment at the turn of the millennium, then the Godfather was someone who worked in more of the distribution side, as his gimmick was that of a pimp. Obviously then, given this was the late 90s, the audience of mostly young males took to Charles Wright's character happily here as, each and every week, he brought a cavalcade of his ladies of the night down to the ring, usually women he had procured from local gentlemen's clubs. Could this gimmick have worked in other eras of WWE? Almost certainly not. And the reasons for that are pretty much the same reasons as those for Val Venis. If you put this one in the 80s, or even prior to that during the territory days, it likely creates a bit of a moral panic. And if you put it in the 2000s, 2010s, or 2020s, it almost certainly feels out of date for the times we live in today. Hell, even during other parts of the 90s, such as in the New Generation era, the Godfather simply wouldn't have been a thing. And we know that because Charles Wright was in the WWF then, but he wasn't playing the pimp at this stage in the game. No, instead, he was either playing the role of voodoo priest Papa Shango or the supreme fighting machine turned activist Kama Mustafa. And even after The Godfather was developed and it turned into such a huge hit for the Las Vegas native, it ultimately had a pretty short shelf life, with the whole thing actually being finished as a full-time act by the time 2000 came around, and Wright was instead forced to rebrand as the more parent-friendly Godfather. All of this is to say then that there was a very small window of time where the Godfather was going to get over in WWE, and luckily for the man behind the gimmick, he was able to be there at that time, ready to go. But not all Wild Attitude Era gimmicks were perfect for that time period because they were pushing the boundaries of taste. No, some worked best then because they hit on a bit of a zeitgeist, which was the case for our next subject, Gangrel. Now, you may have heard of a rather obscure television show called Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And when we say obscure here, we're clearly joking because back during the late 90s, the exploits of a teenage vampire hunter and her friends was amongst the most popular shows on the planet. So when you combine this with the fact that movies like From Dusk Till Dawn and Interview with the Vampire were such big hits, it's safe to say that the undead were in. And that made it the perfect time for a wrestling vampire to rise to the forefront too, one who went by the name of Gangrel. Yes, it was during the Attitude Era that Gangrel first hit screens as part of Monday Night Raw. And boy did he get over here, as his undead lifestyle was instantly attractive to the audience watching. Not because they were all vampires themselves, of course. No, more so because David Heath represented something about the alternative crowd at the time in that he liked to live the life the Gothic way, something which was particularly popular back then. Could Gangrel have worked in a different era? Sure, it's not like being dark and moody or living a Gothic lifestyle has exactly gone out of fashion over the years, but there was something about his presentation which just screamed late 90s. and that made this the perfect place for him to exist in. Seriously, his entrance alone felt like it was ripped straight out of the underground blood rave scene from Blade as he walked down to the ring with one of the best themes of all time, all while he was sipping on what Jim Ross described as a red viscous liquid. It just wouldn't have hit as hard if it had come around in 2005 or 1985 for that matter. No, the Attitude Era was the peak moment for Gangrel to exist, as with there being so many other wild mid-card acts filling up the roster at the time, he fit right in with the generational tone of the show. That of a crazy freak show where vampires could coexist with psychos in masks, redneck, anti-heroes, and whatever the hell the artist formerly known as Gold Dust was. But even those didn't represent the craziest gimmicks of the turn of the millennium period. Now, if we're talking about freak shows, then we'll find a true bona fide one in our next subject, another which existed at the perfect time, the Oddities. Who were the Oddities? Well, they were a collective of the weirdest and wackiest characters WWF had on the roster back during the late 90s, with their ranks being made up of two legitimate giants in the form of Giant Silva and Kurgan, a horror movie villain in the form of Luna Vachon, a masked South Park fanatic in the form of Golga, a hip-hop clown act in the form of the Insane Clown Posse, and for a while at least, Don Callis. Yeah, it was a truly bizarre group, one which even stretched out to briefly add both George the Animal Steel and Sable to the roster too at one point. So as you would expect, this was something which was a better fit for the late 90s than it would have been for any other time period. After all, this was the era of TV shows like Jerry Springer or radio hits like The Howard Stern Show, where the idea was to get the weirdest and wildest people together and watch as the chaos ensued. And for all the weird and wild characters the Attitude Era had, there were few weirder things back then than taking John Tenta, the guy who had once been a huge star in the late 80s as Earthquake, and rebranding him into a mute guy who really loved nothing more than Eric Cartman. Really, it was all just something which you had to be there for to truly appreciate, a real time and place moment, and not one which would have worked anywhere near as well in a different era of the company. Come on now, while the Golden Era and New Generation Era certainly had their fair share of cartoon characters, this was a different kind of cartoon, less Scooby-Doo and more Ren and Stimpy. And while the 2000s and beyond also had moments of leaning into the goofiness, this was the kind of goofiness it's hard to imagine standing there alongside a Randy Orton or a Dave Bautista. Just look at the fact that by the time this era was over, they were too, never to be seen as a full collective again. But then maybe that's for the best, as it allows them to exist at their peak in amber, and for the joke to never get old in much the same way as was the case for our next subjects, three men who, while they would succeed in other time periods too, only truly reached that next level when they came together as a trio during the Attitude Era, the one, the only, Too Cool. Now, there are a lot of characters who you could say embody the Attitude Era: Stone Cold Steve Austin, The Rock, Mick Foley, Team Extreme. But one act which doesn't get brought up enough in these conversations is the collective made up of Rikishi, Scotty 2 Hotty, and Grandmaster Sexay. And that's a shame because really, if you were there at the time, it's impossible to overstate just how over Too Cool was there for a while, way more over than anything which started out as a comedy mid-card act had any right to be. Just look at the fact that if you walked into any school playground in 1999, every kid knew what the worm was, and more than a few knew how to do it. Really, it was a pop culture moment which Scotty 2 Hotty doesn't get enough credit for putting out there into the larger population. And then of course there was the excitement which came every time Rikishi went to do one of his signature stink faces, or when the three all gathered together in the ring to have a post-match dance-off. Sure, this kind of act could have worked in other eras as well, but it was during the Attitude Era that it thrived harder than it could have at any other time, as with wrestling never being more popular with kids, it meant everyone could roleplay as their favorite member of the group in between classes. But we've talked about the Attitude Era a lot already, and there are other time periods in WWE's history, of course, time periods in which different acts thrived in ways they perhaps wouldn't have elsewhere. And one of those periods would be the New Generation Era, the point that we saw the rise of our next subject. Who are we talking about here? Why, Doink the Clown, of course. Now, if there's one era of WWE's history where the cartoon wackiness was at its greatest, it was the New Generation Era. And that's because this was the period where it felt like every second wrestler on the roster moonlighted as something else. We're talking about Duke the Dumpster Droese also being a garbage man, the Goon also being a hockey player, and the Godwins also being pig farmers in their spare time. What none of them were, though, was a circus clown. Now, if you wanted to find that in your WWF television, you had to look to Doink. And this wasn't just a clown either. No, it was an evil clown, or at least it was during its original and best incarnation. That's right, after being introduced to TV in 1993, the early version of Doink, portrayed as he was by Matt Bourne, was far more sadistic in his nature, a lot closer to the Joker than he was to Ronald McDonald. But as time went on and WWF made attempts to get kids back on board with the show following things like the steroid trial and the exit of Hulk Hogan, they'd shift Doink into a more lovable babyface direction, with this version being played by a number of different performers like Steve Lombardi and Steve Kern. As you would expect then, this only turned Doink into an even bigger hit with fans at the time, and made this an even better era for him to exist in, as if he'd come around a few years later during something like the Attitude Era, the whole thing would have felt much more passé. Really, if there's any negative to be found in Doink's placement during the New Generation era, it's that we didn't get to see enough of him in that original darker incarnation, the one which was less Cesar Romero and more Heath Ledger. That said, had he not shifted in tone, the other people who ended up playing him wouldn't have gotten a chance to add their own spin to things. And one of those people, someone we already briefly mentioned in Steve Kern, actually has another spot in today's video, as before he was playing the role of Doink the Clown, he was taking on the part of another act which came across at the perfect time for it to get over to the highest level it could, Skinner. Now in truth, while Skinner is often thought of as a New Generation act, he actually exists in that weird no man's land between eras. Every time period has them, whether it be the transition between the Attitude Era and Ruthless Aggression Era in 2001 and 2002, or the shift from the PG era to the current era sometime around 2022. And back during the early 90s, around 1991 and 1992 to be precise, this was a stage WWF found themselves in as the Golden Era came to an end and the New Generation era was still waiting to rise up. So while things like the Wrestlers with Jobs gimmicks hadn't fully risen to the forefront yet, they were already being experimented with. And that's where Skinner comes in, because he very much feels like an act which straddles both this world and the world of larger-than-life territory era guys who thrived during the 80s. Why is that? Well, because he was one of those larger-than-life territory era guys, with him first rising to prominence in the likes of Championship Wrestling from Florida and the American Wrestling Association during the 70s and 80s. Come the early 90s, however, he was working for the WWF, and this was the point he'd be rebranded as Skinner, a swamp-dwelling alligator hunter from the Florida Everglades. It was what would happen if you tried to take that Eddie Graham style of 80s gimmick and put it in the cartoon-soaked era of the tail end of the Golden Era, all while giving it a coat of that Wrestlers with Jobs paint, which was soon to be the norm for almost everyone. Could Skinner have thrived in another time period? Maybe, but probably not to the same level. Hell, even if he'd been around when the New Generation era was in full swing, he'd still likely have felt somewhat out of place, as his old Florida territory look may not have meshed as well with the likes of Diesel, Razor Ramon, and Shawn Michaels. And if you put him anywhere from the Attitude Era onwards, the entire act just doesn't have the same degree of spark. So it's probably for the best that the Skinner character came around when he did, as once it came to an end, Steve Kern still had time to go on and do other things in WWF. Things which would get to see him be around when our next subject had his brief moment in the sun during New Generation era WWF television, someone who back then was known to fans by the name of Adam Bomb. Now, there have been a lot of great Adams throughout wrestling history, most of whom are still around in some form today. One Adam who's never gotten his full due is the one who rose to prominence during mid-90s WWF. And boy, did this one exist at the perfect time, because if there was ever a character which screamed mid-90s WWF, then it was Adam Bomb. Why is that? Well, here's a guy who wasn't just a wrestler with a bomb, he was a nuclear weapon, who moonlighted as an in-ring performer. Kind of. Yes, the idea was that Adam had been a survivor of the 3 Mile Island disaster, and that this had left him irradiated and, in true comic book logic, effectively superpowered as a result. Really, this was about as 90s as it got when it came to the presentation of a wrestling character. And it worked for a while at least, because while his run in WWF wasn't a long one, Bomb's time spent there is something which is still remembered to this day. Sure, it might have played decently during the Golden Era, but honestly, it was the New Generation era in which it clearly fitted the best. And that's evidenced by the fact that by the time the summer of 1995 came around, Adam Bomb would be gone from the company. Not that this would mark the end of Brian Clark's run there though, the man who played the gimmick. That said, when he did return to WWF years later, it would be under a different guise. That's right, it would be as one half of Chronic that Clark got his second run in WWF with during the Invasion angle, with this character being a far cry from the nuclear-powered superhero he'd been before. But then maybe that was for the best, as Adam Bomb would have likely stuck out like a sore thumb in 2001. And he's not the only one who could have stuck out greatly if he could have been taken from the New Generation era into the post-Attitude Era world instead. No, there are many other gimmicks from that time period which this statement would also apply to, one of which is our next subject as it happens, Max Moon. Now, if you thought that Atom Bomb was a comic book character come to life, then Max Moon was on another level altogether, as his gimmick was literally that of a Moon Man. Needless to say then, this was an incredibly mid-90s gimmick, and one which seemed to fit right in with the overall environment during New Generation era WWF. Of course, there's more than one Max Moon to discuss in this video though, as like with Doink the Clown, here was a character which was actually played by multiple performers over the years, with the first of those actually being Conan, current day ambassador to WWE's most recent purchase, AAA. Had things been slightly different then, Conan would have also been the last person to portray the gimmick, as the whole thing was initially designed to be his long term. But when creative differences led to the Cuban star parting ways with WWF pretty quickly after the character started being developed, it would be shifted over to a new person instead in journeyman performer Paul Diamond. Yes, if you remember watching Max Moon on screen, it's likely the Paul Diamond version which you saw, as it was his version that took up the vast majority of the gimmick's lifespan. No, he might never have won any titles or anything, but Max Moon is a gimmick which is still memorable enough to be talked about today. Really, given how short of a period of time it was around for, it's amazing it's had the long-lasting impact it has. But then that's probably a testament to just how eye-catching and out-of-the-box it was when it first came around, during an era where out-of-the-box characters were exactly what WWF was looking for. Was it as eye-catching as our next entry, though? The dastardly heel known as the Repo Man. Now, if you ever needed any proof that any job could be turned into a wrestling gimmick during the early to mid-90s, then the Repo Man was all the evidence you needed, as he was quite literally a repossession man turned wrestler. That is to say, when he wasn't fighting his opponents in the ring, he was taking away their goods, such as he famously did with the Macho Man when he stole Randy Savage's hat away from him. Obviously then, this made him a perfect fit for the time period when the New Generation era was just about to rise up, as it felt like a trailer for what was about to become the norm. Really, in some ways, this one is to the new gen what Goldust was to the Attitude Era. And because the character was played by Barry Darsow, formerly known as Smash from Demolition, it meant the whole thing still felt like it had one foot in the prior Golden Era too, which made sense as a lot of the Repo Man's rivals would be the last people hanging on from that time period. But let's move away from that middle ground between the Golden Era and the New Generation Era for a moment and over to the middle ground which existed between the New Generation Era and the Attitude Era, that late 1996, early 1997-ish period. That was when our next subjects first rose to prominence in WWF, and so perfectly would they fit in with the time period, they'd also managed to find success as things fully progressed into the Attitude Era too. Who are we talking about this time? Who else but Mosh and Thrasher, the Headbangers. Now, if there was one thing the late 90s were all about, it was counterculture. Mostly the kind of counterculture that involved being into punk rock, nu metal, and things like long chains which held your wallets to your jeans for some reason. And pretty much all of this was personified in the team known to fans as the Headbangers. Why was that? Well, they were what would happen if Beavis and Butthead were brought to life and put inside of a wrestling ring. Two hardcore music fans whose gimmick was to stand out as much as they possibly could at all times. Really, they're the kind of act which wouldn't have looked out of place doing stunts on Jackass alongside Johnny Knoxville, Chris Pontius, and the rest of that crew. And that made them a perfect fit for WWF as the Attitude Era was starting to arrive. That's right, if you put this duo just a couple of years earlier, it doesn't work at all. And if you put them in the latter half of the Attitude Era when the likes of Chris Jericho, Eddie Guerrero, and Kurt Angle were raising the game in terms of in-ring action, they don't quite fit as well there either. No, the best period for Mosh and Thrasher to come around was that magic time during the Proto-Attitude Era, as well as the first half of the era itself. The point where it was still more about crazy characters without their gimmicks than it was about work rate between the ropes. Yes, it's the difference between having a mid-card made up of folks such as the Godfather, Val Venis, and the artist formerly known as Goldust, instead of a mid-card made up of performers like Dean Malenko and Jeff Hardy. Yes, these were two very different times smashed into one in many ways, and the Headbangers certainly thrived more in the former. This was when they were at their most effective, so it's just as well that this was the time they existed in. But then the same could be said about everyone else we've looked at today too, as they're all examples of performers who found themselves in the right place at the right time, and as a result of that, were able to become bigger stars than they would have become in any other situation.